Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Children of Time, which is episode 22 of season 5. Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Deep Space Nine, one episode at a time. In this video, I cover the 5th season episode, Children of Time. So Children of Time is the episode in which the Defiant is exploring a planet in the Gamma Quadrant with some weird time shenanigans. And Dax insists it would be safe to travel there, but they go there and the ship is struck by energy beaming thingies and it hits Kira. Then they go to the planet and find a civilization there of 8,000 people. And they know all about Benjamin and his name and what he likes. And they beam down to find out that it is in fact a colony of their of their descendants. And they tell the story that the Defiant, while trying to leave the planet, gets knocked back in time 200 years to crash on the planet. Kira dies from getting hit by the beam thingy. Dax eventually, the symbiont is passed on to a person named Yedrin, who they meet. And Odo is still around, yet he's super old. The actual Odo who's on the Defiant is lost the ability to hold his solid form because of the shenanigans that are happening on the planet or whatever, but the Odo that's been there has learned to control his shapeshifting. Anyway, so Yedrin Dax comes up with a plan to have the Defiant travel back in time and get duplicated. So one version goes back in time and starts the colony, but the other version goes safely back to Deep Space Nine. That way they can have their cake and eat it too. Problem is, Jadzia eventually finds out that this plan is a fraud and is never going to work, and it is in fact designed to have the Defiant purposely travel back in time 200 years and get stuck on the planet. And so once Cisco knows that, he refuses to do it. Kira tries to convince him otherwise because she'd rather sacrifice her life than allow 8,000 people to simply disappear. But Cisco's having none of it until they get together with the people on the planet who is their last day before they all disappear, and they're working the fields and growing crops, and Cisco and the others work with them, and they realize that they just can't do it. They can't bring themselves to allow these 8,000 people to just disappear, so they make the decision to travel back in time just like they're supposed to. However, when they attempt to do so, this sets program takes over the navigation and forces the Defiant to avoid the time shenanigan, which makes everyone on the planet disappear. We soon find out that it was Odo who programmed the Defiant to do so because he did not want Kira to die. This upsets Kira, and she doesn't know how to feel about it. But now she's aware, because the older Odo told her, that Odo loves her, and she doesn't know how to react to that either. So I'm just looking right now. I'm pretty sure this is the last time we get time travel shenanigans in the show. Oh no, there's not. There's Wrongs Darker Than Death or Night. Oh god, I hate that though. But I don't know, this one feels more like timey, wimey, like twisty, weird sciencey thingy. And we don't really get that. I mean, there's Time's Orphan. So maybe not the last time we do time travel, but I don't know. To me, it's the last, Time's Orphan's kind of, I don't know, that's kind of weird anyway. I mean, there's also, what's that one? Far Beyond the Stars, but that's not time travel, that's just a vision that Cisco has. I'm trying to think what else. So yeah, it's not the last time travel one, but it's the last really twisty, this feels like the concept of it feels more like it belongs in TNG or Voyager. Like Deep Space Nine usually doesn't do with the weird, timey stuff. But I mean, they make it all dark, which was Ira Stephen Bear's intention, to try to make it fit more with Deep Space Nine. So, first thing I gotta talk about this episode is the time travel. And I mentioned this in other videos where I talked about this episode, because a lot of people, not everyone, but there's a sizable group of people who really, really like this episode, who thinks it's one of the better episodes of the show. I had to sadly disagree with that. And my main issue with the episode is the time travel logic. So, what happens in this episode is a paradox. It's pretty impossible. So, the premise is the Defiant goes to this planet where they meet their descendants, because when they leave the planet, they're supposed to get knocked back in time 200 years. But because Sisko decides, or actually it was Odo, because old Odo decides to force the Defiant to not travel back in time and miss the thing, the whole colony ceases to exist and everyone disappears. So, here's my question. If these people never existed in the first place, then why do Sisko and the others have memories of meeting them? They should have never... They either exist or they don't exist. Let's see if I can explain this. So, from listening to Yedrin Dax and Odo and the people who were alive at the time the Defiant first traveled back in time, they tell stories about how they, how the Defiant crashed and how they strived to survive, and when they went to leave the planet, they entered the anomaly thingy. Nowhere in that do they mention coming across a colony of their own descendants. So, what they're describing is, from their perspective, Defiant visited a planet, it was empty, they tried to leave, and upon trying to leave, Defiant gets thrown back in time. So, I don't understand. If that's the case, then how come this Defiant finds a group of descendants there? Like, the descendants are either there or they're not. Like, this doesn't make any sense. Is what they're describing is, like, I don't really even know how to describe it. It's like a loop where the first time around they don't find descendants there, but somehow we're following the second time around. But that doesn't make any sense. Like, and if the descendants exist, then the Defiant should not be able to not go back in time. If they don't go back in time, and those descendants never existed, then they never should have existed in the first place. Sisko and the others should have never met them. Like, unless, like, trying to think, come up with the explanation. Maybe there was a Defiant from a parallel universe that somehow traveled through time and dimensions to come into our universe, and they crashed on the planet, and so they didn't experience any descendants, but they created descendants. So when the real Defiant from the Prime universe goes into the planet, they see the descendants, but the descendants are actually from this parallel universe Defiant. Like, that could make sense. But then again, like, that's kind of like, they never suggest this. They never suggest that this is a parallel universe Defiant. Could you say it's from an alternate timeline? Like, there was the timeline was altered so that there's descendants there. Like, this doesn't make sense, because in yesterday's Enterprise, when they changed the timeline, boom, instant change-o. There's this, other alternate timeline that's created because the Enterprise C traveled into the future, and when they pushed the Enterprise C back, then the one and true timeline changed. Nobody remembers anything because that timeline never existed, or didn't continue to exist anyway. It did exist for a while, but then when they corrected it, it changed. But here, it's when they decide, or when Odo forces the Defiant not to go back in time, then the whole timeline should change. But then it's a closed loop, because Defiant goes to the planet and sees their descendants, then the descendants should always be there. There shouldn't be an example where the descendants are not there when they go to the planet. And so if they travel back in time when they left the planet, then and if they don't travel back in time, then none of this should have happened. They should have not found any. Those descendants should have never existed. Like, it's a paradox, because the descendants exist. That means when the Defiant discovers them, that causes them, because Odo's among them, Odo causes them not to travel back in time. But if they didn't travel back in time, then those descendants never existed in the first place, so Odo wouldn't cause them to travel back in time. But if Odo never existed to cause them to travel back in time, then they would have never traveled back in time. Like, it's a paradox. It can't work. It doesn't fit. It's kind of like it's a grandfather paradox. The grandfather paradox is, if you travel back in time, you kill your grandfather before he conceived you, or conceived your father or mother, then you never exist. But if you never existed, then you can't travel back in time to kill your grandfather. But so you do exist. But if you do exist, you travel back in time and kill your grandfather, which you can't be. That means you never. See how it's like a circular logic. Now, I think the way that the episode gets around this loop is by doing what I just said, painting it so that Yedrin and the other people remember a different timeline. They remember going to the planet and nobody being there. But that doesn't make any sense. Like, why weren't their descendants there when they first went? Because they are the same people. Like, they are the Sisko and the others. So there's somehow a new timelines created because descendants are there. But descendants were always there because the Defiant had to already go back in time. Otherwise, there would be no descendants there. So that the Defiant traveling back in time already happened. It's just a poor misuse of time travel. Now, I heard someone try to excuse this before, and I was looking for the comment. It was on my channel, but I couldn't find it because I remember reading it and being like, huh? Like, that just doesn't make any sense. That's like not how time travel logic works. They just said, oh, well, it created an alternate thing. Like, huh? Say what? Like, so I was trying to think of ways they could have done it that would have made sense, that would have made it work. Now, if I know I've talked before about how Star Trek uses Type 2 time travel logic. They don't use, like, you go back and you alter the timeline. They don't use Type 1 time travel logic, which is a closed loop, which is whatever happened. But there are a few episodes that try to do this. Sometimes they try to sneak it in where it doesn't make sense, or otherwise stick closely to it, like Time's Arrow. And if you did try to do this as a closed loop, then it would have made sense. So when the Defiant went to the planet and they saw descendants there, and the descendants said, hey, this is what's going to happen, and then Sisko's eventually like, no, we don't want to crash your ship. But then they, work with them and decide, oh, well, this is, we are going to stay there. And so they purposely travel back in time. That would make sense. That would be a closed loop. It was always meant to happen that way. The reason why the descendants existed is because they're always meant to exist, because them existing is what causes the Defiant to travel back in time to make them exist. So that makes perfect sense. Problem with that theory, though, is that there would be no show. The main characters would be stuck on this planet, which of course they can't do. They got to get them back to the station. So, solution is to do Yedrin Dax's plan. Create duplicates of the ship so that one goes back in time and one stays. So this is what frustrates me about this episode, because had they stuck to Yedrin Dax's plan, then it actually would have made sense. That would satisfy the closed loop, because again, they would probably have to talk about, like, Yedrin Dax would have to remember being Jadzia and meeting himself because his descendants would have always been there. But even so, like, they would that would satisfy them. And maybe you could do it like a bootstrap paradox, actually. That the reason why Yedrin remembers doing this plan with the thing duplicating is because he remembers meeting Yedrin as Jadzia and Yedrin telling him this. And so it's like it would be a bootstrap paradox, which I'm okay with. It means the idea of duplicating the ship came from nowhere, that is stuck in the loop, because Yedrin would have introduced it to Jadzia, and then Jadzia would grow up to Yedrin and remember this plan from having done it, and so now Yedrin would introduce it to Jadzia, and so it would be a closed loop, like a bootstrap paradox type thing. That would have been fine. And also, like, and to think about it, is like the duplicating thing reminds me of the Voyager episode Deadlock. Although it wouldn't be exactly the same, because in that case the antimatter wasn't duplicated and they were stuck holding the same antimatter. Unless they could say that the Defiant that crashes doesn't have any antimatter, and that's part of the reason why it crashes. So this would actually make perfect sense. This would fix the paradox if you had duplicates, because this then makes sense that so you could have that closed loop and at the same time allow our characters to return back to the show to have more episodes. That's the way you could have your cake and eat it too. So had they stuck with Yedrin's plan, that would have been great. That would have made total sense. That would have satisfied this. It wouldn't create this illogical paradox. It would have been good time travel logic. But the problem then becomes, what's the threat of the episode? You no longer have this moral dilemma about, do we let all these people die? So here's a way to solve that issue while creating the closed loop. Let's say that the episode played out pretty much how it was, and that Yedrin's like, well, maybe he couldn't have this plan. Let's scrap it. He doesn't have a plan. He just tells them flat out, you need to travel back in time, otherwise we won't exist. And then boom, moral dilemma from the start. Never have this Yedrin plan. Never have them have a plan. Never have them fake out and think that everything's going to be fine. Have it from the very beginning. You need to crash. and then so then we have all the moralizing. We have the moral dilemma. We have old Odo talking to Kira and saying you need to live. And then the Defiant deciding, no, we can't. At first they're like, we're gonna go, fuck this, we're gonna go back, and then they go out and plow the field or whatever, and then they're like, okay, we do have to listen to Yedrin, and we do have to crash. And then when they enter anomaly, it naturally, the anomaly, thingy, naturally creates a duplicate one. And the duplicate goes forward in the future. And so when the duplicate is leaving the planet, they're thinking that everyone's going to disappear, but they don't. They're like, huh? What the hell happened? And they're able to use their scanners and sensors and say that there was a duplicate Defiant created that did go back in time. And so everyone on the planet still exists. So what I'm saying is don't introduce the concept of the doubling thing. Don't introduce that. Have that be like the surprise. And actually Yedrin did know this the whole time, and they could even have Jadzia and Cisco saying like Yedrin knew this would happen. He tricked us into thinking that we had to go back in time, but really he knew a duplicate Defiant would be created. That would be an interesting twist, and it would make sense. It would hold up the lie. It would avoid this paradox. Now, it seems obvious to me they wanted this, like, and this is something Ira Stephen Bear is quoted as saying, that he wanted it to be dark and have this dark twist and blah. But the problem is like that dark twist doesn't make any fucking sense. Like if the colony never existed, then they never would have met anyone there. Then it never would have existed in the first place. Either the colony either exists or it doesn't. You can't say it just disappears, because then how was it ever there in the first place? The Defiant never traveled back into the past, and the colonies would have never been there. And the Defiant did travel back into the past, and the colony was there. Then the Defiant needs to travel back in the past again, otherwise the colony would never exist. And if it never existed, then let's go with the Yesterday's Enterprise Type 2 time travel logic. Let's say that there was a timeline where the Defiant traveled back in the past and created the Descendants. However, it doesn't make sense. I think this is what the episode's saying. The episode's saying there's a timeline when the Defiant traveled back to the past, created this colony, and then so now this is like a new timeline where the Defiant travels to the colony, and now they see the colonists, and because the colonists are there, the future Erdo is able to alter it so they never travel back in the past, and that alters the timeline so that now they never existed. But if they never existed, then Odo wasn't there to make sure they don't travel back in time. And it's a grandfather paradox with Odo. If Odo doesn't exist to stop them from traveling back in time, then they never travel back in time. But if they never travel back in time, then Odo would never exist in the first place to force them to not travel back in time. Have I made your head explode yet? Yeah, talking about time travel like this is fucking nuts. But, yeah. So that's my issue with this episode. And I think, yeah, the explanation I had heard to try to fix this, it doesn't work. The plain truth of it is they needed Yedrin's plan to work. By making Yedrin's plan not work, it creates a paradox that doesn't make any fucking sense. That none of these events should have ever happened in the first place. It's a paradox, and it seems to. And so I would compare it to like the Voyager episode, Course Oblivion. Although I don't think it's nearly as pretentious as that episode is. But it's kind of pretentious in a way, because it creates an illogical paradox that can't exist in order to have a depressing ending, in order to be all, pretentious, in order to be like, ooh, look at how dark this is. They had to let 8,000 people not exist. But problem with that is that it's contrived, it's forced, because it's an illogical paradox that can't exist. So they're forcing this depressing dark ending in order to, they create a paradox in order to force this dark ending, which actually doesn't make any sense. The ending that would make sense wouldn't be all dark and pretentious. But if I still think, like, my idea of having it be a surprise, like, it does create a duplicate surprise define, but they never knew this, and there was Yedrin kind of tricked them and played them into actually creating a duplicate without telling them that, because he didn't want to alter anything, and he kind of knew that's how events already occurred, like a closed loop sort of thing, and so he was just playing his part to recreate exactly what had happened, because, as I said in my version, the original Defiant, like Yedrin and old Odo, have memories of meeting, well, not Odo, because he would have been the goo, or the Defiant, unless old Odo linked with him in the same event, but regardless, they would have memories of meeting, like when they first went to the planet, they met the descendants, and they traveled back in time, and they knew how they traveled back in time, so they knew that it was a duplicate, and they knew that there was a duplicate Defiant that returned to the station, but they were pretending like they didn't know this in order to make sure events happened the way they did. Here's another question I have. If this episode, the way it is right now, the paradox way that doesn't make any sense, when the Defiant met the descendants, why don't the descendants, like, refuse to talk to them? If they want events to play out exactly the way they did the first time around that caused this colony to exist, why don't they just be like, yeah, we're not interested in talking to you, fuck off? Maybe they think that by doing so it will alter things, but again, it shouldn't alter anything. Like, this should have happened the first time. Like, that settlement should have either always been there or always not been there. It was there, not there before, then it was there, and then it was not there again. That doesn't make any... Damn it! It doesn't make any sense. So yeah, I mean, that's another way they could have played it. They could have been like, "Oh, we don't want to talk to you. Just fuck off." And that way, they could have events play the way they did before. Make sure to define trouble back in time. Like, why would they tell them, "Oh, we're your descendants"? And because that's the first thing Cisco said. He's like, "Well, now that you told us what's going to happen, we're going to avoid it." And of course, Yedrin. The answer is Yedrin had his plan, but it was really supposed to manipulate the Defiant to ensure that it travels back in time. His plan was actually bullshit. So that's how they were going to trick him. But still, it seems to me the safer option would just refuse to talk to them and tell them to fuck off, or don't mention, like, hey, we're your descendants. Like, just don't talk to them. Anyway. This is a deal breaker for me. I'm sorry, it is. There's, like, some episodes, like past tense, their time travel logic doesn't make any sense whatsoever, but I don't care because it's such a good episode with good characters. I think the problem for me with this episode is that the ending is so dependent on this nonsensical paradox that can't exist, and that's what I can't accept it. Because it shouldn't happen. Because it doesn't actually make any sense. It's like, God, trying to think. It's like, if a Romulan shows up on the planet and says, opens up like a portal using his hand, and travels back in time and undoes everyone who died in that episode, and fixes everything, and they never explain who that Romulan is or how this Romulan had these powers, and they just, like, said, oh, it was a god or something. I'm trying to think of an equivalent of an impossibility that doesn't make narrative sense. You wouldn't accept it. And so I don't accept it. I think the fact that time travel can be so confusing, like I was just getting into, and you have to sort of logic it out, which most people wouldn't have, have the time or the inclination to do. They just would accept what the movie tries to tell them, like Back to the Future, for example. That movie, their time travel logic makes no goddamn sense whatsoever. And so, yeah. So, this is a deal breaker for me on this one, because it makes it come off as pretentious, as I said, because they're like, oh, we want this dark ending, and so let's create this paradox that actually doesn't make any sense and shouldn't be able to exist in order to have this dark ending. Where what they should have done is had Yedrin's plan work and try to create a moral dilemma, try to create drama, try to create some sort of interesting storyline within that blueprint, like, because it needs to work in order for this not to be a paradox that makes no sense. See what I'm saying? And so I can't look past it. Because it is the whole episode. Now, another whole thing about is where Kira first learns that Odo is in love with her. And this is the big reveal. I think I remember seeing this in the trailer. So, like, a shocking reveal. And Odo's like, I love you. I'm glad that this is one thing I do like about the episode. I was kind of sick of this, like, will they, won't they, or like Odo keeping it to himself. And the fact that Kira broke up with Shakar off screen, good. I remember hearing that, and I'm like, oh, thank God. That was such a dumb relationship anyway, and like they ruined his character, his last appearance anyway, and it wasn't really that interesting. Apparently, the actor was barely available. He was like hardly ever available and hard to get and cost too much money, and so they're like, let's just break him up. That was the right decision. And also, like, I'm a huge fan of the Odo Kira pairing, as we're gonna get into, and so I'm glad that this set the stage for it. Apparently, both Nana Visitor and Renee Auberjonois hated the Kira Odo romance, particularly, well, at least when this episode was filmed. I'm not sure how they feel about it later when they actually did it, but yeah, Nana Visitor said she didn't like this episode because of the Odo being in love. I thought it was actually, that was one of the elements of the episode I actually really liked. I liked seeing the older Odo, and they soften his makeup because it makes sense. He had 200 years to work in the shape-shifting ability, and now he had a totally different disposition and wanted Kira to live, even if it wasn't him that was going to be with that Kira, even if it was a different version of him. That's fascinating to me. That's one of the aspects of the episode that really worked. But the whole thing, the rest of the episode was just like people being like, oh, this is my descendant. When we crashed, this is the person I hooked up with. Like Bashir constantly being like, oh, I hooked up with this lady. And it was funny because he said her name, and O'Brien's like, who? He's like, yeah, that's what I said. But apparently she just transferred on board the Defiant a week ago. He's like, well, maybe I should ask her out when we get back to the station. I wonder if he ever did. That's something they should have shown on screen. That would have been interesting if they actually made it a long-term relationship. I think they should have done that, but no, they didn't follow up on that. And apparently Rita Tannenbaum was the person O'Brien hooked up with, and he was being all refusing and very much against it, which, is fine, whatever. I gotta talk about the Sons of Moog. Why don't they call themselves the Sons of Worf? Like, they don't know Moog. Moog was never on this colony. Moog just happened to be Worf's father. This show seems obsessed with constantly mentioning Moog's name over and over and over again. Moog this, Moog that. In some cases it works. But, like, yeah, when Worf's house was, they called it the House of Moog. Shouldn't they call it the House of Worf, since Worf was the one who was still alive and Moog was not? But this is, to me, an even worse example. Like, Worf is the one who was the founder of this house. He's the one who was crashed on the planet and created this house, so why don't they call themselves the Sons of Worf? Like, I'm sorry, that pisses me off. Maybe I'm being petty. I do like the concept, though, that they accept people who choose to be Klingon. They don't necessarily need to have Klingon heritage, because Worf was the only Klingon on the colony, so it made sense how most of them were, like, diluted and none of them really looked full Klingon. Which made sense, and I like how they accepted anyone. They didn't even have to have Klingon heritage. Like, that was cool. That was a cool aspect I did like about that. But it brings up another issue. When I was watching, I was thinking, shouldn't most of these Klingon descendants also be Trills? If it began with Worf and Jadzia having baby, then shouldn't, like, Yedrin also be part Klingon? Because he explained, like, oh, the Trill symbiont was passed down through your descendants, through the generations. Well, wouldn't the first descendants be half Trill, half Klingon? Unless, and the show never actually said this happened, but unless multiple wives had to have multiple husbands, and they had to have, like, do like a what's that episode called, Up the Long Ladder situation, where each wife has 3 husbands so they can widen the gene pool. It does seem like, and I know Brandon, my Patreon supporter, is going to bring this up, but it does seem like 48 people is not a big enough gene pool, especially if you're going to have monogamous relationships. It seems like they would have to have done a situation where each man had 3 wives and each wife had 3 husbands or whatever. Like, in order to, but even then, I'm not sure if 48, I don't know how genetics work exactly, but I'm sure that 48 people would not be enough. You know, it's funny, I was watching Planet of the Apes, and there was these 3 guys who went with this one woman to another planet, and Charlton Heston was like, oh, she was supposed to be our Eve to start a new civilization. It's like, you can't start a civilization with 3 guys and 1 woman. Like, that's the 60s for you. I don't know. This 48 people, was that enough of a gene pool? Like, maybe I could buy, but they would have had to have multiple partners, which is not what they're suggesting. Like, saying O'Brien ended up with a specific wife and Bashir ended up with a specific wife. They're not saying that they... But anyway, I don't know. Maybe they use... Dr. Bashir used some high-tech 21st century doohickey thingy to correct this, or add more to the gene pool artificially or some bullshit. I don't know. Maybe they did create clones. Not sure how that would have worked. Yeah, I think there were some interesting scenes, like between Yedrin, Dax, and Jadzia. Like the one in particular where they figure out he was lying, and she confronts him, to see them sort of just exchange this look between each other without saying anything. Like, that was powerful, like, because you get the sense that they're, you know, the same person. They each have the symbiote. One is just an older version, and so that's, yeah, it's an interesting concept. I will give it that, but they just should have done it correctly instead of creating a paradox that doesn't make sense. I'm sorry, as I said, that's a deal breaker for me. Like, I can't like this episode because of it. Sorry, I know some people do, but no. I was trying to think, like, which episode I like better, this or E Squared. E Squared, of course, is the Enterprise episode that, like, rips this one off. E Squared doesn't create a paradox, so by default I think I like it better. But the fact that it's just copying what this episode already did is kind of a big knock against that episode. But they also tie it into the Zindi story arc. And it does seem like an unnecessary episode that's there as filler for the Zindi story arc, that they should have just gotten to the point. So it does seem like a distraction from the main Zindi storyline. But yeah, and I was getting them mixed up in my mind because I thought there was a character, I thought maybe it was Bashir, who never hooked up with anyone, who got left out, but that I was getting that mixed up with E2 because that was Reed, who found out that his other version of himself never procreated, never got with anyone because the Enterprise had a larger male population than female population. But then when I get to that episode, I'm going to have to explain how the hell they were able to create a gene pool using that fewer amount of women. Anyway, no, I think I would have to give it to E2 because it doesn't have this impossibility paradox, this grandfather paradox that they never resolve, of if old Odo forced them not to go back to the planet, but if Odo never existed, then he would never be there to force them to go back to the planet. Or never forced them not to go back to the planet, whatever. So they would have went back to the planet. But they went back to the planet, then Odo would exist, and then he would force them not to go back to the planet, and so Odo would never exist, but if he didn't exist, he wouldn't be there to force them not to go back to the planet. Freaking paradox. Anyway, sorry. I would now like to thank my patron and supporters very much for supporting me on Patreon. It does help me continue with the channel, and it's very much appreciated. I want to give a big special thanks to Brandon Neilhouse, Tyler Cease, Jordan Johnson, and Antarius. Thank you so very much for your strong support. I'd also like to give a shout out to Benjamin Mead, Francisco Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Alessandro Miglosio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Britton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you also very, very much for your support. Let's see. I think we might have... Hold on, I never prepare this when I should. But I think we might have a Facebook comment. Maybe a couple Facebook comments on this episode. Yeah, if you check out my Facebook page or Blue Sky page, there's links in the description below for both. I ask for comments on episodes that I'll read in my videos. They do have to be shorter than the Patreon comments, but... yeah, you can leave those if you want, and I will read them in my videos. So, first Facebook comment. This is a nice little self-contained episode. I like seeing older Odo in the community, but I feel like this is a season 2 or 3, not 5, not in the middle of the Dominion stuff. That's actually quite fortuitous that you said that, because I was just reading that this was originally written as a season 3 episode. But Receiving Bear didn't want to do it because they had just done past tense, and they were planning on doing the Visitor, so they thought that they had already too much time travel shenanigan. And eventually when they got to season 5, they're like, oh, maybe now's the time to do it. Apparently someone else pitched an idea that was very similar, and so they hired both writers to independently write different stories. I'm not sure what the original pitch was, if it still was about inheritance and if it still had this paradox, but that's just the story that I heard. Next comment is from David Spence, who says, when Harry Kim spent 15 years trying to find a way to save Voyager, it frankly comes across as stupid that Dax spent 2 centuries content to just let things play out. Well, to be fair, he wasn't content to let things play out. He purposely tried to manipulate the Defiant to force them to travel back in time by promising them this duplicate thing that he knew was bullshit. But, you know, it would have been way better if he actually did did come up with a way to do the duplicating bullshit. That way we could avoid a paradox. But anyway. And Ryan Williams just posted a meme that says, love this. Well, fair enough. Alright, so let's get into the Patreon comments for this episode. First comment is from Benjamin Mead, who says, I like this episode. Yedrin Dax's guilt, the planting scene when the Klingons show up especially, and Quark as the teacher are all highlights of this episode. The debate on whether to leave or not is also interesting, and seeing which characters are in favor of which option. Odo sabotaging the plan is another story. I'm not sure how I feel. On the one hand, it's definitely interesting and unexpected, but I'm not sure if it's out of character. Also, I read on Memory Alpha, and I was reminded that Odo is supposed to have the changeling virus, so old Odo would be dead. Obviously, the writers hadn't come up with that idea yet, but when they did, they clearly say he is already infected at this point. Yeah, it was supposed to be Homefront Paradise Lost when he was infected, which means, yeah, he would have already had the virus at this point, and he would have died because Bashir is very clear did not have the means to cure him by himself, and Bashir wouldn't have access to any other help, so clearly he wouldn't be able to. But again, as we say, this is a storyline invented in season 7, so that's a problem they created in season 7 by saying that he was infected. Norman Buckwald responded to this comment, saying, in between, when Odo likely unknowingly affected the entire Great Link at his trial, they turned him into a human, which, since he was for a while a solid, did not have that virus. So either the virus is activated again inside Odo when the baby changeling turned Odo into one again, or he got it from the female shapeshifter in season 6. I'd argue the latter, so that old Odo can survive whether the writers intended it or not. Likely at the time of the episode they had not come with the Section 31 virus yet, so not intended, but it works canon-wise, I'd argue. Well, that's some really good headcanon logic there, just ways to excuse it. I mean, I would have thought that that virus existed even when he was a solid, and then it came. I didn't think it would go away when he's a solid and then come back when he the baby changeling. But you know, you can logic that away, saying that did get rid of the virus, but he had already infected the link, so that when the female changeling linked with him again in season 6, then he was reinfected. And maybe that would explain why the changeling started showing examples of the virus before Odo did. But again, this is all retconned. I mean, they didn't come up with this until the ending arc of season 7. So, but that's a way to headcanon it around it. So it works. Anyway, next comment is from Antarius, which says, when I watch episodes like these, I always wonder who is in command of the station. Maybe Bog. It's nice that we investigate a planet in the Gamma Quadrant again. Since the Dominion showed up, these episodes are very rare. The dilemma between personal happiness, Kira's survival, and the continuation of their lives on DS9 on one side, and the obligation to these descendants on the other side, is a great and very compelling. The whole execution of the episode is fantastic, and I rarely get emotional watching TV, but I almost teared up watching this episode. My rating is a 10 out of 10. Score last 10 episodes. Antarius 5, Kyrie 5, draw. It's competition to be first. Yeah, the only problem is a paradox. Shouldn't happen. They either exist or they don't. But anyway, no, I'm not going to get into this whole thing again. It's a paradox. Next comment is from Norman Buckwald. It says, when I first saw this episode, I really loved it. The whole idea of the dilemma of what to do regarding the existence of life of their descendants, adding Kira's death as a further challenge was good stuff. But in hindsight, knowing what happens and what happens to the rest of the series, let alone this is their last Gamma Quadrant exploration before the war, it seems a bit of a nuisance. And knowing what would happen, of course Cisco could not go back in time, etc. So the only remaining draw with respect to the series at large in continuity is, of course, Odo and Kira finally learns Odo loved her, and yet again is just like after Necessary Evil and things pass, a reminder that Odo and Kira do have their darkness, and this alternative Odo loved Kira so much and wanted to have a chance with her, he did not think of all the people with which is quite astonishing. Unfortunately, this darkness, while definitely remembered in the Occupation arc for sure, when Odo gets together with the female changeling and for a brief time changes side, seems to be totally forgotten with Vic Fontaine magic later on. There is interesting beats with other characters and O'Brien's dig to Worf that he never even sees his son. I'd say rock on. Unfortunately, the writers decided a lame way to bring Alexander back the way he did. That was not true to his character, Sai. I'll give it 8 acres to plant for the sake of your temporal existence out of 10. Actually, I don't have a problem with Odo being dark and deciding to save Kira. Even if it, not only is he letting 8,000 people die, it's including him. He's sacrificing his own life as well as, an entire colony of people to save Kira, and I buy that. I completely buy that. Apparently, the original idea was to have Yedrin be the one who changed the program, but then Iverson Bear said he didn't like that and he wanted it to be Odo. I think Yedrin's plan should have worked, so I don't like either outcome. So I don't think either one works because I'm sorry to keep repeating myself, but it creates a paradox that doesn't make any sense. So the only way to resolve this episode would have been to have Yedrin's plan work somehow. But I know, I'm just broken record at this point, but everything comes back to that for me. I can't, it's impossible for me to look past that. I can't. Anyway, next comment is from Kyrie091, who says, Children of Time, more like Still Drek of Mine. Well, great, this sucks. You're bored with this booty crap. Makes me want to shit on this poo hill. It just feels like poo on me, and it just smells like mud, these turds. By the end of this episode, I feel awfully bore-snotting. When I watch this episode, I find myself saying, take this now. Good content is not in this episode. Mark, please let me watch something else because I have had enough of poo. I'm guessing that second paragraph had all these other puns you came up with before, like poor, like poo snotting or whatever the hell he said, or mud these turds. I think I remember mud these turds. I don't remember bore snotting. That's what you said. I don't remember all those other ones, or take this now. I think maybe I do remember take this now. I don't know. Those are your not so great hits. Anyway, I wonder if you're serious about not liking this episode, or is that just a fun way to make jokes? I don't know. Next comment is from Brendan Neil Howells, who says, this is the last time that the Defiant will ever venture into the Gamma Quadrant. Kira and Shakar broke up off screen, which is very lazy. Seeing as all the senior officers are on board, I cannot help but wonder who is looking after Deep Space Nine. Sorry, but there's no way that 48 people can make up a viable gene pool, much less 8,000 people, which is represented by one village living the agrarian good life and a handful of people who have chosen to live as Klingons. Does anyone else get an uneasy feeling about Yedrin, or is it just me? Oh, and by the way, Kira dies a few weeks after getting hit by an energy beam on the Defiant. I feel sorry for Miles O'Brien. Not only will he lose his wife and children, but he will be stranded on the planet crawling with Bashirs. I like the idea of the Sons of Moog, who are Klingons by blood or choice. Gaian Odo has not only learned to shapeshift properly and finally confess his love to Kira, but this is a paradox because Odo would have been infected by Section 31 already. I enjoy Benjamin Sisko with the baby, but the biggest sin of this episode is that Jake is never mentioned. 5 images of Quark teaching math to the colony children out of 10. Well, I will correct you on one thing. Jake actually is mentioned in this episode. There's a line where I believe it was Yedrin Dax who was saying to him how guilty he felt. He thought it was, Jadzia's fault for wanting to explore the planet without realizing how dangerous it was. And he said, every time I looked at you, all I could think of is that you'd never see Jake again. So there you go. There's your Jake mention. So they did mention him once. But I think it was good enough, personally. That's the paradox is not the Odo thing. The paradox is the fact that the Defiant never traveled back in time, and these people would have never existed in the first place. And if they didn't exist, then they wouldn't force the Defiant not to travel back in time. That's paradox. Anyway. Yeah, a lot of people seem to have problem with the entire senior staff going off on the crew. I never do. I never care because I just see it as like it's necessary to have all the main characters. It's just it's a show, or that's how the show needs to handle things. And I could always there's some dumb Starfleet lieutenant or ensign or whatever who takes command. I don't care. I don't know. I'm just not bothered by this, but does seem to bother some people, and that's valid. But it just doesn't bother me. It's just a storytelling device that they need to do from time to time. I'm fine with it. It means we have all our main characters on an episode like this, then fine. I like the idea of the Sons of Moog too, but they should have been called the Sons of Worf. Anyway, thank you, patrons, so much for your comments. So my rating for Children of Time out of 10 is going to be a 4. Sorry, you know what I'm going to say, because I repeated it ad nauseum during this review. But as I said, I cannot look past the fact that this creates a paradox, that the time travel logic in this does not make any sense. The colony either existed or it didn't. It's not like, it didn't exist, then it did exist, and now it doesn't exist again. That doesn't. As soon as the Defiant traveled back in time, it created the colony, so it should have been there the whole entire time. Now you could say it's. Now I'm getting into the whole time travel bullshit. You could say that it did exist, but then it didn't. But then again, I don't know. It creates the grandfather paradox, because if old Odo was never there to force the Defiant not to go back in time, then it would have been back in time. But if he was there, then he wouldn't be there. Yeah, they're either there or they're not. Sorry. It's just, it bothers me, and I can't look past it. It's impossible. I'm sorry. I apologize to all the people who love this episode. If you want to love this episode, you go for it. If you think, Mark, you're thinking too much about it, I don't think your paradox makes sense. Time travel shows do this shit all the time where they can change things and change the timeline, and it doesn't matter. They change the timeline to these people. But at the very least, I'm sorry, but at the very least, if they did change the timeline so that these people never existed, why do they remember them? This whole thing about Odo saying I love you, that shouldn't matter because Kira should have forgot it if that timeline never existed. If that Odo never existed. Now, I know Star Trek usually comes up with some bullshit like, oh, the ship was surrounded by tachyon time wibbly bullshit, and that's why we remember. Like they did that in past tense, but no. Now, this is different than past tense. This is past tense. I can overlook the time travel logic not making any sense. This one I can't, because it's just too integral to the plot, and also it's like it's pretentious. It's, oh, look, we're gonna have this dark ending where these people don't exist anymore. Ooh, look at that, isn't that dark? Maybe have an ending that actually makes fucking sense instead. I'm sorry, that's just this is my personal preference in this matter, and you could have found ways to make it interesting. That's what frustrates me about this episode, is that it could have been good. Like, there's avenues they could have taken to make it make sense, and also be a good episode at the same time. Like the suggestion I made about having Yedrin's kind of playing with them the whole time, knowing and not telling them, but knowing that the Defiant would be duplicated. Like, that would be a good storyline, but nope. They went the pretentious route instead, so I am giving it thumbs down, 4 out of 10. I will give it 4 because it's well acted, well shot, has some good character interactions, has some good moments like I mentioned, but it all, like, can't give it a positive rating because it's the glue that holds it together fell apart. It doesn't hold. So yeah, and I know everyone's their mother's gonna disagree with me. It's fine. That's fine. This is just how I feel about it. 4 out of 10 for me. So that is it for my review of Children of Time. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment below. Just tell me how wrong I am and how the time travel... You know, if you can explain to me how the time travel logic makes sense in a way that I actually believe, that doesn't just sound like headcanon nonsense, I'll be open to hear it. But I am skeptical, though. It's going to be hard to convince me. Your argument's going to have to be really good. But I'm open. I'm open to give it a shot. Anyway, like, how is this not a grandfather paradox? That's what I want to know. But anyway, so if you do want to support the channel, you like the channel, like what I do, you can support me on Patreon. There's a link in the description below. I have different rewards such as pre-releases. You can request a video for me to do, and I have a series of patron-only videos where I revisit reviews I've already done exclusively for my patron supporters. So you can check this out if you're so inclined to do so. So, let's see... oh my gosh. Hold on. Here we are. Okay. Thought I lost my schedule. Alright, so let's see what's coming up next on the channel. On Monday will be my review of the Voyager episode Displaced. Wednesday will be my review for the DS9 episode Blaze of Glory. Thursday I will be reviewing episode 8 of Starfleet Academy. And Saturday over on Patreon, finally doing a patron exclusive video where I will be revisiting my review for Worst Case Scenario. So that's what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to check me out as I continue to cover Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Voyager and many other videos on Star Trek and other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.